This year's All-Star game was absolutely horrendous. There was many blooper-like moments, just many moments where you kind of like, why are we even doing this? Like as a fan, you're watching the games, you're trying to be excited. Everybody loves to see all these stars all in one space. But in all honesty, why do we even do this every single year? I feel like we always hype ourselves up, and then as soon as when the moment comes and we see how terrible it is, like it is every single year, we get upset. And this year was no different. I mean, this year was just absolutely brutal and very tough to watch. But that doesn't mean that there aren't ways where we can fix this. And really, it starts with, if we're gonna start from the very bottom, right? We gotta start with the skills challenge. Because what is the skills challenge? Ever since they've kind of like put that as one of the biggest things that you can do during All-Star weekend, I've always questioned, well, what's the point of it? Like, these are NBA players. Yes, they might not be great in terms of going over obstacles or going through obstacles or anything like that. But like, these are NBA players, so you would expect them to do like somewhat decent, somewhat good. They had the LED floor on the bottom to kind of like give you a little bit more a direction of where you're going. But the issue is that, well, just because there's an obstacle on the floor doesn't really mean that the players are just going to go wherever the intended route is supposed to be, especially with there's a lot of space on the court still. If you're going to try to pigeonhole them one way in one direction, then you kind of have to make it more obvious, because you just having a little dummy in the court doesn't mean that they can't go left or right. It just, you're not really stopping anything. And so that, which you saw a lot of times during the game, where you had players who simply just didn't know where to go, that is just was not fun to watch. I mean, it was a clown show from the very jump. So when you had that happen, and then we're not even going to talk about the Rising Stars or like the G League team versus the NBA teams, and how that kind of was just a regular thing that we didn't really need to see. But if we're going to stick with the skills challenge and you want to somewhat do something, because in my opinion, I don't even think you should even have the skills challenge in the All-Star weekend games, because I just think that it is pointless. And, they don't really take it serious. And to be honest, I don't know why you would. I mean, this is one of those things where it's like, unless you do something very creative, which is one of the things that I'm going to say that we can fix, where instead of just having a regular basketball court, not just have some obstacles, but actually change the environment of the court. Put like a hill, put like a little foxhole, put something that they have to go under, over, around, and make it extremely obvious. But if you're me and you're watching this and you're saying, well, even with all that, I probably still won't care, I would like to replace it with something else. And everybody loves the idea of a 1v1 challenge where it's position locked. So we're not going to have point guards going against centers or centers going against shooting guards. It is point guard versus point guard, or guard versus guard, forward versus forward, and then centers versus centers. That is something that everybody would like to see every single year. Because one also is a lot of pride on line. These NBA players are very sensitive people. Of course, why not? Your whole game is attributed to your whole personality and your life and whatnot for a lot of these folks. But imagine in a 1v1 situation for these all-stars, you get appointed to the 1v1. And then you have to pretty much fight for bragging rights until the next year. That's going to cause a lot of narratives to circle around the All-Star game to make it a little bit more hype, make it a little bit more fun, and more anticipation for the, what's supposed to be the fun time of the year. But this is not fun times. And I don't know if this has been already shut down by the NBPA, or it's just something that hasn't even been brought up in their negotiating agreements. But this is something that should definitely be in the All-Star games. This is something that everybody would want to see. Like, what would you do if you had Paul George versus another great guard, like a young upcoming guard, like a Anthony Edwards, and you see what old versus new look like? Or you have the bigs go at it, where it's Jokic versus Embiid, or for this year, probably Jokic versus Bam Adebayo. How that will go. Like, when you see the games where it's like you have to play offense and you have to play defense. I mean, we all know what the 1v1 is, but it means a lot more. Or how electric would a Stephen Curry versus a Trae Young would be. That would be insane to watch. And then, of course, put some incentives behind it. Now, the only plus side to this All-Star weekend was the fact that in almost every single All-Star weekend, the three-point contest has emerged to be one of the favorites of the weekend because of how fun, and there's a lot of parity within it. There's still a lot of skill. The players take it serious. And nobody wants to be a player who is, practically terrible on the three-point line, even though you're good in the regular season. And so when you saw that there was a lot of hype, that was good, that was great. It's great for the game. But honestly, the biggest moment from that was the Sabrina Ionescu versus Steph Curry, and we all know, listen, I was nervous because if Sabrina did not bring her A game, we all know what NBA Twitter would have been like. And we all know how NBA fans are just in general. But she saw awesome. Like, she literally tied Damian Lillard's high score, which won him the three-point contest. Which that means that if she was in the three-point contest, she would have won as well. She's a prolific scorer, prolific shooter, and it's great to see on display how she even matches up with a lot of these NBA players. And I know there were some talks about, like, oh, why didn't she use the men's ball? It's like, who cares? She's a woman. She's using the women's ball. She's shooting from the NBA three-point line, and she shot quite well. Now, the only issue is she went against one of the greatest shooters, if not the greatest shooter of all time, in Stephen Curry. And Stephen Curry just decided to put out, a measly 30 points in that shooting contest. But outside of that, the three-point contest is one of the best contests, or at least games, in the All-Star Weekend set list that we always come to see every single year, and we love it. We love seeing it. Now, one thing that we have kind of grown out of loving, and this is very painful for me because this used to be my favorite thing to watch, is the dunk contest. Good Lord, what happened? In all honesty, the dunk contest wasn't as terrible as it was in years past, but the issue is we always come down to there are technical dunks and then there are in-game dunkers, right? We want to see technical dunks. We don't want to see the regular in-game dunks that we usually always see. This year you saw a lot more technical dunks with Jacob Toppin and Jaime Jaquez, but in all honesty, it wasn't really moving the needle in terms of it being an enjoyable experience. Thank goodness for Mac McClung. If we're going to be 1,000% honest, he brings the excitement to the game. He brings a lot more pizzazz, a lot more theatrics to the game. And it is amazing to watch where you have a guy who's probably practically 6 foot tall, same height as everybody else, but is jumping over a 7 foot tall Shaquille O'Neal, clearing him with no trouble. And that is great to see. But we cannot hinge our enjoyment of the dunk contest off of one player. And it sucks because we know that his opponent, Jaylen Brown, who is the in-game dunker that we all love to see. And listen, he does have some great posters. Do not get me wrong on that. But when we come to dunk contest, it's not what it's about. It's not what it's about at all. Jaylen Brown had one of the most lukewarm performances I've ever seen. The best dunk that he had all night was the tribute to Terrence Clarke. Not only because it was a tribute to Terrence Clarke, but it was actually a really good technical dunk. You're not going to get many props from me by dunking over a 5'3" Kai Cenat sitting in a chair, and you're barely clearing him with your legs still touching him. That is not something that I am really enthused to really see, right? You're not going to get a lot of props from me by just doing a basic one-hand dunk and covering your eyes afterwards. Now, I do respect that there is a little bit theatrics in that, but this is something going back to the fix that I will have for the dunk contest because it is quite literally terrible. One of the biggest fixes that I have is we should have street ballers versus NBA players. There are a lot of street ballers, i.e. Jordan Kilkenon, who is one of the best dunkers of all time, like quite literally. And many people might not even know who that is, especially when you tune into All-Star Weekend. Many people didn't even know who Mac McClung is, but if you watched his summer highlight tapes, right, when he was on the Summer League, you could see that this guy could dunk, right? But Jordan Kilkenon is relatively unknown. Imagine if you had him versus Mac McClung and how electric that would be. Or you even have a few others, right? A few more street ballers versus NBA players. And then that kind of brings it back because NBA players, like I said, are very sensitive players, very sensitive people. They do not like being upstaged. And so you're going to bring your best NBA players versus street ballers. And you're going to have to be a little bit more technical, a little bit more creative. Because the street ballers, all they have is creativity. All they have is time, not playing NBA games. And so they're going to bring their A game. And so it's going to be a nice dichotomy between the two. However, if you don't want to do that, right, if you don't want to have street ballers, people who don't play in the NBA, one of the best things you could easily do is involve more theatrics. Remember when Blake Griffin jumped over a car? Or when Dwight Howard had the Superman cape and did what was kind of like a basic dunk, but it is the theatrics of it all that kind of brought everything together. Or when Victor Oladipo started singing before he dunked, or when Gerald Green blew out the cupcake when he dunked. I mean, there is a lot of theatrics into the game. And so if we emphasized hey, we need to have more theatrics, and the NBA has, they work with the players and instill a lot more theatrics within dunk contests, and so the players aren't just doing regular dunks with, one or two people holding the ball up and just doing a basic dunk. That would be great. And this calls back to the reason why one of the most prolific dunk contests between Aaron Gordon and Zach LaVine was so awesome is because, well, one of the best dunks of all time, double under the legs over a mascot on a scooter thing. I don't even know what you call those things, right? He did that, and then boom, we have a great dunk, right? It's the theatrics of it all. So the NBA should easily, they should work with these players to think of some creative ways in order to make the dunk contest a little bit more fun to watch, right? Because if we don't, well, then it's just going to be as boring and as bad as it always is. But it is never as bad as the actual All-Star game. The All-Star game, for the most part, has almost always been bad for a long time, at least for the last 5, 7, 8 years. It's almost always been kind of bad. It's always been kind of lukewarm, right? Shout out to Kobe Bryant, because when Kobe Bryant was playing, he always took it serious, along with Chris Paul. Always took it serious. And in all honesty, one of the best All-Star games of all time was when, after Kobe Bryant died and they had their first All-Star game, and they was playing like they were possessed. But, ever since that kind of died down, and the whole pizzazz of just it being one of the most boring things to watch. I mean, what are we even watching it for? Are we watching it for it to be serious, or are we watching it for it to be fun? And this is where it really comes down to it, because if you want a very competitive game, this is obviously not the format that you want. If you want a very competitive game, you need to do a lot more, or a lot of different things, in order to incentivize these players to play a little bit better. And what is one of those things that we have already seen so far in this season alone, that has incentivized players to play a little bit better, even though the games are, a little bit more meaningless, or have a little bit more meaning than a regular season game? And that was the in-season tournament. But what made the in-season tournament so great is that there was incentives. There was incentives for you to play well. And in the All-Star game, there needs to be a little bit more incentives too. Getting paid $500K or whatever, how much the amount was, is great, especially for the players who aren't going to play that often, that are sitting on the bench. Everybody had a desire to win it. And so we need to bring those type of incentives back to the All-Star game. And so what are some incentives that at least I am thinking about that we should put in? Now, it really depends on two things. Are we going to be serious? Are we going to be competitive? Or are we going to have fun? If we're going to be serious and competitive, we need to put incentives more so on defense, where, let's say you get 10 blocks, you get a chunk change of money. If you have 4 30-point players, you get a chunk change of money. If you get 10 steals, you get a chunk change of money. If you keep your opponents under, let's say, 150 points for the whole game, you get a chunk change of money. Something like that incentivizes the players to be like, okay, no, I got to actually think of this different, because I want more money. And I know the fans don't like hearing that, because the fans always want to be heard, felt, and appreciated. But the reality is the players are playing for selfish reasons. And so you give them more reasons to be selfish. And this is the exact way to kind of do that. Now, if you're going to have fun, which I'm all for, one of the best things that you can do is have a little bit more wild card. Don't make it just a regular game. Make it unserious. Make it as goofy as you can possibly can. So, for example, we can add some wild cards. Let's say if you make a floater from the 3-point line, you get 4 points. If you are shooting from a spot on the floor that is worth 4 points, you get 4 points. If you're shooting a logo 3, you can either get 10 points or deduct 10 points from the other team. If you are shooting a half-court shot, the other team can flip the score. If you're shooting a half-court shot, you can flip the score of the game. So that means that if you're losing, it's more advantageous for you to shoot a half-court shot in order for you to get back on the winning side. But also, if you're the team who's playing against the other team, you don't want to have your score flipped, and so you actually play defense at least somewhat close to the half-court line. Incentivize these players to do more. And listen, this is a ridiculous format. Having all these little wild cards are ridiculous. But let's be honest with ourselves. Are we really watching it for it to be competitive, or are we watching it for ridiculousness' sake? And honestly, if you add both the incentives and this ridiculous fun factor thing that I just mentioned, you still will have a pretty exciting game. At the end of the day, we have to incentivize the players to do more, because if we don't, we're going to have games like this, weekends like this all the time. And I hate doing this song and dance where we have to expect the next year to be better, because in all reality, this is a good indication that unless something is changed, The All Star weekend will be terrible for years to come.